This method is used in the tertiary sector like government services, banking etc. and also in the commodity sector if output data is not available. The limitation of GDP in this area prevents it from measuring the economic welfare people get. What are the alternatives to GDP to overcome the limitations it poses? 250. Gross domestic product (GDP) is the total monetary or market value of all the finished goods and services produced within a country's borders in a specific time period. As a broad measure of overall domestic production, it functions as a comprehensive scorecard of a given country's economic health. Insta-secure synopsis. YouTube, Facebook, Samuelson and Nordhaus liken the ability of GDP to give an overall picture of the state of the economy to that of a satellite in space that can survey the weather across an entire continent. Body. GDP is a poor way of assessing health of our economies. Simon Kuznets, who developed concept of GDP, warned it was not a suitable measure of a country's economic development. He understood that GDP is not a welfare measure, it is not a measure of how well we are all doing. It counts the things that we are buying and selling, but it's quite possible for GDP to go in the opposite direction of welfare. In contemporary times, with the changes brought on by the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the measure is even less of a reflection of the things that really matter. GDP counts bads as well as goods. When an earthquake hits and requires rebuilding, GDP increases. When someone gets sick and money is spent on their care, it's counted as part of GDP. But nobody would argue that we are better off because of a destructive earthquake or people getting sick. GDP makes no adjustment for leisure time. Imagine two economies with identical standards of living, but in one economy the workday average is 12 hours, while in the other it's only 8. GDP only counts goods that pass through official, organized markets, so it misses home production and black market activity. If people begin hiring others to clean their homes instead of doing it themselves, or if they go out to dinner instead of cooking at home, GDP will appear to grow even though the total amount produced hasn't changed. GDP doesn't adjust for the distribution of goods. Again, imagine two economies, but this time one has a ruler who gets 90% of what's produced, and everyone else subsists barely on what's left over. In the second, the distribution is considerably more equitable. In both cases, GDP per capita will be the same. GDP isn't adjusted for pollution costs. If two economies have the same GDP per capita, but one has polluted air and water while the other doesn't, well-being will be different but GDP per capita won't capture it. GDP is unable to fully capture the benefits of technology. Think of a free app on your phone that you rely upon for traffic updates, directions, the weather, instantaneous information and so on. Because it's free, there's no way to use prices, our willingness to pay for the good as a measure of how much we value it. GDP fails as a measure of human well-being. Since the institution of GDP figures in country rankings, other measures of the quality of life have appeared. E.g., the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development (OECD) annually issues a report based on a study of 140 countries, indicating the levels of happiness in those countries. For at least the last decade, European countries such as Denmark, Finland, have ranked at the top and India is nowhere to be seen. Economists have focused too narrowly on the economic side of human aspirations, setting aside human yearnings for belonging to social collectives and nations. Insta-secure synopsis. YouTube, Facebook. The progress is too unequal. The Oxfam report which shows that 1% of the people own about 60% of the wealth in India. GDP is neither a measure of welfare nor an indicator of well-being. Oh, that is because it is not set up to recognize important aspects of our lives that are not captured by the acts of spending and investing. Oh, there is no room in GDP for volunteering or housework, for example, nor does it recognize that there is value in community or in time spent with families. Oh, more measurable things such as damage to our environment are also left out, as is job satisfaction. GDP doesn't even measure the state of jobs. Capitalist systems founded on a religion of property rights have treated nature that nurtures as an externality to be exploited. Thus, it does not take into account the sustainability of future GDP. GDP also ignores important factors like environment, happiness, community, fairness and justice. But these are important aspects of development. It does not allow for the health of children, the quality of their education or the strength of marriages, neither wisdom nor learning, neither compassion nor devotion to country which makes life worthwhile. GDP also assumes all growth is good growth. Savings from energy-efficient devices counts as a negative for GDP growth, even though it is a positive for society. GDP does not take into account the value of non-monetized activity. Care activity of women. GDP does not differentiate between more or less productive economic activity, i.e. implicitly assumes that economic activity is the desirable ends rather than a means to an end. All value additions for self-consumption, which are not put out in the market, are not accounted in the GDP. Way forward, broader, non-monetary measures are required to assess the well-being of citizens. Green GDP could be used which attempts to adjust for environmental factors. The other alternative measures include OECD's GDP alternatives, which adjust for leisure. The Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, which accounts for both pollution costs and the distribution of income. The Genuine Progress Indicator, which adjusts for factors such as income distribution, adds factors such as the value of household and volunteer work, and subtracts factors such as the cost of crime and pollution. There are more direct measures of well-being such as the Happy Planet Index, GROS, National Happiness and National Well-being Accounts. To make the world better for everyone, consumers must learn to be better citizens and to democratically govern the local systems within which they live. Insta-secure Telegram, YouTube, Facebook, HTTPS, value addition. Benefits of GDP as a tool to measure the growth of a nation. GDP consists of consumer spending, investment expenditure, government spending and net exports. It provides an insight to investors which highlights the trend of the economy by comparing GDP levels as an index. GDP is used as an indicator for most governments and economic decision makers for planning and policy formulation. GDP is not the perfect way to measure growth, but among the alternatives, it is the least inaccurate method to compute the growth rate of the country. GDP is also used as an indicator of a nation's overall standard of living because, generally, a nation's standard of living increases as GDP increases. If by growth one means the expansion of output of goods and services, then GDP or preferably real GDP which measures growth without the effects of inflation is perfectly satisfactory. Calculation of GDP provides with the general health of the economy. A negative GDP growth portrays bad signals for the economy. Economists analyze GDP to find out whether the economy is in recession, depression or boom. GDP growth over time enables central banks and policymakers to evaluate whether the economy is in recession or inflation. In that sense, it is still required. GDP has held significance as a universal metric over the years. It is inaccurate to say that GDP does not capture well-being. It captures at least the well-being that results from the production of goods and services. Indeed, when statisticians quantify the goods and services produced, they take into account their utility to the consumer.